So I got a rather interesting comment on a video I put out called Schopenhauer on Asceticism. I'll read the comment first and then talk a little bit about it. So the comment starts off, #mwahaha. You talking of philosophy and you haven't even heard of Stoicism. What a joke. Of course, Schopenhauer was interested in philosophy, and as any philosopher, he read other philosophers, especially Socratic ones, and obviously Stoic ones, where he took most of his ideas on asceticism, main virtue of Stoic philosophers. What I'm hearing in this comment is something like as follows, that basically this viewer seems to think that I've left out something important, that I've underemphasized, or I guess didn't mention at all, this supposed influence that the Stoics had on Schopenhauer's so-called ideas about asceticism. So first thing I want to point out is that Schopenhauer does not have any ideas of his own about asceticism. I don't think that he presents himself as having anything new to say about asceticism, which is good because, quite frankly, he doesn't. But maybe that wasn't made explicit in the video, which, in all fairness, was only about 3.5 minutes long. So there's a good chance that there's a lot that didn't make it in there. And secondly, the reason Stoicism didn't come up is because, well, it wasn't relevant. The aim of that video was to talk a little bit about things that Schopenhauer himself wrote in a single chapter of a single book called The World as Will and Representation. And we were only looking at chapter 68. Or I suppose we didn't really look at the text itself in that video, which is actually part of a longer series that I'm still fleshing out. But anything that I said about Schopenhauer and the Ascetics came from that chapter in the book. It is true that Schopenhauer engaged with Stoic philosophy earlier in World as Will. That would be found in chapter 16. But ultimately, Schopenhauer is primarily critical of Stoicism. And just to, get this out of the way, he does not take anything from the Stoics about asceticism because the Stoics were not ascetics. Well, at least most Stoics would not consider Stoicism to be equivalent to asceticism, which is the next thing I want to talk about. It's true, I'm not an expert on Stoicism. I don't incorporate really many ideas that Stoics had into my own life. It's just, for whatever reason, not a school of thought that I've studied much of. So I did have to do a little bit of homework on this. And what I found is that quite frankly, it seems like this is something Stoics themselves are tired of hearing about. This idea that Stoicism and asceticism are really the same thing. Overwhelmingly, I found writings from Stoics, or at least people who identify as Stoics, denouncing this comparison, with possibly one exception. And just to kind of point people in the direction of what I'm talking about, there is one article called Are Stoics Ascetics, which is by Pyotr Stankiewicz. I'm definitely pronouncing that wrong, sorry. But I'll put a link to that in the description. And ultimately, this author determines that Stoics are not ascetics. But in the same journal, Modern Stoicism, another Stoic named Kevin Patrick wrote an article called Are Stoics Ascetics? A Rebuttal, where he refutes that idea. He seems to think that Stoics actually might be ascetics after all. But that was really the only case I found of someone from within Stoicism itself trying to defend this comparison. But in summary on that, this is certainly not a unanimous view, and in fact it seems to be an unpopular view within Stoics themselves, that Stoicism and asceticism are the same thing. But maybe there's some reason to think that that's not true. Maybe they are similar in ways that people haven't thought of. I'm going to take a fifth on that because, like I said, Stoicism is not really my area of expertise. So I'll leave that to the Stoics themselves to work out. But I'm going to have to say that this claim that asceticism is a main virtue of Stoicism, that if it is not false, it is at least controversial to make that claim. So we've got kind of a triangle going on of Schopenhauer, Stoicism, and asceticism. And I've thought about this, and it doesn't seem like we can get all three of those elements in one room together at the same time. You can get Schopenhauer in the room with the Stoics, and you can get Schopenhauer in the room with asceticism. It's still unclear whether you can get Stoics and ascetics in the same room at the same time, because, like I said, that seems to be something that Stoics themselves are, some are still debating, it seems like. So definitely not a unanimous view. But obviously, if there's so much writing being done on this question, ostensibly there's people making this comparison, well, there's got to be some reason. And maybe the reason people think, whether correctly or not, that Stoicism and asceticism are equivalent, or at least extremely similar, maybe the same reason that people correctly or incorrectly feel that way has something to do with why this viewer thinks Schopenhauer and Stoicism, has something to do with the things that Schopenhauer says about the religious ascetics. And I thought that was an interesting question to explore. Quite simply, there are a number of differences between Schopenhauer and Stoicism, which we can find by looking at what the Stoics themselves wrote, we can find by looking at the history of how Stoicism developed, and we can look at how Schopenhauer's own philosophy actually unfolded. Basically, one of the differences that is, I think, maybe the biggest difference has to do with the way that Schopenhauer and the Stoics understand the will. So to whatever extent the Stoics engaged in practices which might resemble those of religious ascetics, which again, I think we've determined is at least controversial, if not false, it was certainly not to the end that we might annihilate our will, as Schopenhauer would have us do. Rather than eliminate the will, the Stoics were interested in regulating it. Rather than extinguish the will, the Stoics aimed at redirecting it towards better ends. This is totally different from the way Schopenhauer addresses the problem of the will. Insofar as he thinks it's the root of all suffering, the root of all problems, it has to be removed. For Schopenhauer, redirecting the will to so-called better ends really does nothing to eliminate the problem at its source, which is the will itself. Now, why did the Stoics want to redirect the will, or why did they think the will needed to be redirected in the first place? Well, the Stoics, very broadly speaking, believe that our problems stem from wrong beliefs, and so we must train ourselves not to believe the wrong things, and to develop better, more rational ideas about the world. And assent to those better ideas. Assent is a crucial component to Stoic philosophy, assenting to one idea or another. See, the whole issue is we think, or we tend to think, that what is good is actually bad, and what is bad is actually good. So we think things like staying up all night and partying is good, but actually it's bad. We think things like hard work and maybe exercise and eating healthy are bad. Actually, those are good. And the reason we think those things which are bad are actually good are because they're tastier, more fun, more amusing, they instant gratification. The things which are actually good that we think are bad, well, we might find them boring, maybe painful in some ways. certainly don't produce the kind of immediate gratification that we might want. And so that's something that we have to change. Thus, the Stoics' method for achieving this end of, addressing our bad beliefs, proceed from utilizing reason. We think out reasonably whether something really is good or bad. The whole reason we think that, say, exercise is bad for us is because maybe we're only looking at the short term. If you don't work out for a really long time and you start lifting weights, next day your arms hurt, or at least mine do. And so we might wrongly suspect that that means exercising is bad. Now, maybe we don't think about this consciously, but maybe there's just this gut aversion to, driving past the gym. Oh, yeah, it would be good if I went in there, but, I haven't worked out in a long time and I don't feel like doing that. I'm going to go to the donut shop instead. Well, the reason I think the donut shop is a better place to go to, the reason that the impression of the big donut sign is something I assent to, is because on some core level, I believe it is more important for me to eat tasty things like donuts than it is to, exercise my body. So Stoics would say that is a bad belief. Got to work on that. Now, Schopenhauer doesn't think that solves anything, because even if we do keep our bodies in shape and we eat healthy and we work hard, well, eventually we're going to die and it's not going to matter. At least that's how Schopenhauer views it. He is an atheist. He doesn't believe in an afterlife. And so he doesn't see any purpose in prolonging, this existence, which is positively unpleasant and painful in his view. Now, some people might say, well, that's not really a good idea because if his problem is that we suffer in life, well, exercising and working hard and eating healthy, that'll keep away diseases. That'll make us, we'll feel better if we work out. We'll feel better if we eat healthy. Working hard, we can make more money, buy more fun things. So all those things help us enjoy life more. Again, Schopenhauer says you're still going to die one day, so it doesn't matter. Schopenhauer's whole view is even if you lived a life of nothing but pleasure, eventually that life will end. And so Schopenhauer is very extreme in his philosophy, which contributes, in my opinion, and plenty of other people's as well, to his misreading of the ascetic writings, which is not a topic I can really get into in this talk, but is something that I am eager to get into later at some points. Actually, my interest in Schopenhauer's commentary on asceticism really stems from what I think are some very common misreadings of the ascetic writings, kind of exemplified in Schopenhauer. Some of the expectations he has and some of the extremes that he seems to think in terms of, I think are very common and are issues that I've run into myself in studying the ascetic writings. The interesting thing about the ascetics is they're well aware of that. They are well aware of people who really just can't handle life, and that's what attracts them to the ascetic path. But the ascetics will be the first to tell you that's not how this works. Asceticism is not for people who just can't handle the outside world. Or as the monastic Thomas Merton said, the monastic life is not just for people who are introverts. He accused his brethren monks once of being introverts rather than true contemplatives, and understandably pissed them off when he said that. But it's a very common problem, at least as far as people going off to monasteries to get away from the world, which is really not what being a monk is about. It's not about getting away from the world. It's about going towards God. And the notion that those two are the same thing is a very common misinterpretation, I think, of renunciate paths in general, and perhaps religion most broadly. But I think that most people who actually put these things into practice, which Schopenhauer is not such a person, he does not practice any of these things. I mean, we should be clear about that. He's just saying they would be a good idea. He's not actually doing any of them. But the people who actually do put this stuff into practice, who live this kind of life, whether it's asceticism as people typically understand it, or if it's, a monastic life of some kind, regardless of what religion it could be, I think if you actually study the works of monastics themselves and renunciates themselves, they'll be the first to tell you that this kind of escapism through asceticism is not what asceticism is really about. So the other issue with the Stoics for Schopenhauer, though, is they're too rational. And just as Schopenhauer was critical of Immanuel Kant, who wanted to develop ethics purely on reason and abstract concepts and intellectual precepts, Schopenhauer was also critical of the Stoics for grounding their practices and philosophies in thinking reasonably. By contrast, Schopenhauer, rather than from reasoning things out, thinks that it is a shift in perception, which will lead us to annihilating the will. Now, there are certainly some things Schopenhauer says that might seem at first like they are similar to or endorsing Stoicism, such as where he writes, "Every suffering that comes to the ascetic from outside is welcome to him. Every injury, every ignominy, every outrage. He gladly accepts them." But here is where Schopenhauer's reading of asceticism takes a detour away from anything resembling Stoicism, where he continues, "The ascetic gladly accepts them as the opportunity for giving himself the certainty that he no longer affirms the will." Back to that denial of, extinguishing, annihilation of the will. Okay, so the ascetic, on Schopenhauer's view, and again, Schopenhauer could be right, could be wrong, we're not getting into that here today. On his view, the ascetic gladly accepts these external problems, not because he has, using reason, determines them to be, for example, out of his control, as Epictetus would have it. If something is out of your control, Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, would say, don't bother with it. It's not rational to get upset over things that you have no control over. But that's not why the ascetic that's not why the ascetic gladly accepts calamities. As Schopenhauer understands it, the reason the ascetic does so is because it helps them to annihilate the will, which is the whole big problem. So it's not proceeding from reason, but rather from a shift in perception. Now, here's something interesting from chapter 16 of The World as Will and Representation, where Schopenhauer writes, "The most perfect development of practical reason is the ideal represented in the Stoic sage." That sounds like a glowing review of Stoicism. But if you know anything about Schopenhauer, there's one word in that sentence that should come up as a red flag. And what word is that? Reason. Not that Schopenhauer was opposed to reason, but he was very suspicious of any philosophies that emphasized reason over everything else, including the emotions and perceptions. Schopenhauer was extremely critical of Kantian ethics, precisely because Kant tried to ground ethics in rationality and reason, abstract concepts, and intellectual precepts. And if you want to know more about how Schopenhauer developed his own system of ethics as distinct from Kant, I would recommend his essay on the basis of morality, which was an earlier work by Schopenhauer. He goes on to say, "The Stoic ethics is originally and essentially not a doctrine of virtue, but merely a guide to the rational life, whose end and aim is happiness through peace of mind. Virtuous conduct appears in it, so to speak, only by accident, as means, not as end. Therefore, the Stoic ethics is, by its whole nature and point of view, fundamentally different from the ethical systems that insist directly on virtue, such as the doctrines of the Vedas, of Plato, of Christianity, and of Kant." So the Stoics were too rational for Schopenhauer. Just as he criticized Kant for trying to ground ethics purely in reason, He also criticizes the Stoics for doing something of the same. It's also important to look at this part where he says that the Stoics have as their end and aim happiness through peace of mind, that virtuous conduct only appears as a means, not an end. So that's a total inversion of what Schopenhauer himself is trying to accomplish with his own philosophy. It starts out with this shift in perception from the view that we are separate from one another and separate from the world to a view which Schopenhauer ostensibly locates in religious writings of mystics, monastics, and ascetics, a new view in which everything is one, where there is no separation between self and other. From this shift in perception, we, according to Schopenhauer, develop the capacity for compassion. And this shift in perception is important because the way Schopenhauer defines compassion is in such a way that it is impossible to be compassionate unless you have this shift in perception, which is certainly open to debate. But that's the way Schopenhauer defines it, which is what we're talking about here. Finally, through this compassion, we're able to do things which normally we would experience aversion to doing. Extreme measures of self-sacrifice and self-denial now are open to us, and the results of those kinds of practices are the goal, the denial of the will. So rather than proceeding from reason, or from considering or adhering to abstract intellectual concepts, or from thinking reasonably about like what would be a good end, or what should I be concerned about, or what's a waste of my time and energy to worry about, as the Stoics would, Schopenhauer believes that truly moral conduct, as he understands it, and Schopenhauer has very high standards for what counts as moral conduct, that truly moral conduct, on Schopenhauer's view, proceeds from a shift in perception, from perceiving the world and others as separate from ourselves to perceiving all things as one. In the 67th chapter of World as Will, and I'll end with this, he writes, "We have seen how from seeing through the principium individuationis, that's the principle of individuation, in the lesser degree justice arises, and in the higher degree real goodness of disposition, a goodness that shows itself as pure, disinterested affection towards others. Now where this becomes complete, the individuality and fate of others are treated entirely like one's own. It can never go farther, and here's the crucial part, for no reason exists for preferring another's individuality to one's own." Now whether that's true or not, it should become clear now why Schopenhauer would not find much to take from Stoicism in terms of his annihilating the will project that he's always working on. No reason exists for preferring another's individuality for one's own, meaning it's not rational, on Schopenhauer's view, to sacrifice yourself for others. Literally, figuratively, it's not rational to place your own desires or needs after someone else's. I think that's questionable. I think a lot of people would say that it's questionable. But again, the aim here is to try and understand through Schopenhauer's eyes what Schopenhauer himself thought. The reason for doing things like that in philosophy, for trying to, understand how a philosopher developed their ideas and why they developed the ones they did, helps us to understand why we develop the ideas we do. It helps us to hone our own skills in terms of thinking critically, but I think most importantly, it humanizes the philosophers. It reminds us that they are flawed people just like us. And I think Schopenhauer has a lot of flaws, as well as some virtues. If you're interested in learning more about Schopenhauer and his relationship with the Stoics, I would direct you to Weltgeist's video called Schopenhauer, What He Liked and Didn't Like About Stoicism. I think it was a really good discussion of a topic that I didn't really focus on too much here because, again, we're dealing with a lot of moving pieces here. But Weltgeist has a lot of great videos on Schopenhauer. I would recommend everybody check out their channel. And I will post in the description a link to the articles that I talked about from the Stoics. So, yeah, I hope somebody got something out of this. I'm definitely appreciative of constructive criticism, and I am always eager to think about and hopefully answer, or at least explore, questions that viewers have, about, other places we can kind of fuse a philosopher's ideas with, or hey, I think maybe you left something out. Just yeah, drop a comment and let me know. So, thanks.